Today's webinar is being hosted by Breakthrough Action, a 5-year cooperative agreement funded by the United States Agency for International Development to lead their social and behavior change programming around the world. Breakthrough Action is a partnership led by Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs in collaboration with Save the Children, Think Action, Ideas 42, Canberra Collective, International Center for Research on Women, and VMO. Firmly grounded in proven practices, Breakthrough Action ignites collective action and encourages people to adopt healthier behaviors by forging, testing, and scaling up new hybrid approaches to social and behavior change. Before diving into today's topic, we have a few requests for our participants. There is a chat box in the low right corner of the screen, so please do introduce yourself. And all participants are on mute, so we encourage you to submit questions using the chat box or on the Springboard discussion page. If you are not a member of the site, please take a moment to register so you can contribute to the discussion. You can find the link to the discussion on the right box under Resource Library. If you don't quite catch something, that's okay. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording and presentation slides available shortly after the webinar. If you are looking for additional information on today's topic, Giovanni Cabinets will introduce some relevant Breakthrough Action resources. I just want to introduce today's topic. Service providers, whether facility or community-based, are a key link between communities and health systems. A provider's direct interactions with clients means that they play a crucial role as a facilitator and potential barrier to their clients adopting healthy behaviors. A service provider's opinions and biases, attitudes and behaviors, capacity and skills, and working conditions can influence their ability or motivation to deliver quality services. Such barriers may be outcomes of individual, interpersonal, organizational, and institutional factors. It is critical to understand a provider's perspectives, behaviors, and their barriers, as well as the ways in which those barriers impact their clients. Social and behavior change, or SBC, approaches can help identify and address factors that lead to provider-side barriers to quality service delivery. Today's presenters will discuss service providers as an audience for SBC interventions. They will provide program examples from Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Pakistan, and Malawi that apply SBC techniques such as barriers analysis, identifying positive deviants, advanced audience segmentation, and behavioral economics to provider behavior change. Our first presenter will be Luis Fernando Martinez, Social and Behavior Change Communication Senior Technical Advisor from Transform FAR, who will present on the process and outcomes of a family planning provider's barriers analysis and positive deviant qualitative research in Cote d'Ivoire. Next, Jessica Vandermark, Senior Marketing Advisor, Breakthrough Action, will discuss Pathfinder International's Beyond Bias projects in Tanzania, Burkina Faso, and Pakistan. They used advanced audience segmentation to better characterize and address provider perspectives on family planning for youth. Following Jessica's presentation, Kenyon Sola Aibana, Senior Associate at Ideas 42, will describe Breakthrough Action Malawi's current work piloting behavioral economic approaches to motivate provider behavior change among family planning providers. And now, our first presentation. Luis Fernando Martinez is a communications specialist with over 19 years of experience in SBCC training and HR development. His current post as SBCC Senior Technical Advisor for the USAID-funded Transform FAR project is based in Abidjan, where he provides technical assistance to local staff implementing short-term innovative SBCC approaches to increase demand for family planning in Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Cote d'Ivoire. He has an MA from the University of New Haven, which he obtained while holding a Fulbright scholarship. Luis, welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Heather. Good morning, everybody. I will be sharing today an analysis we conducted in Cote d'Ivoire on healthcare provider barriers and positive deviance linked to quality sexual and reproductive health service provision. Let me first make a very quick introduction of our project. Transform FAR is the first task order of a USAID global funding mechanism called Transform. The purpose of our project is to generate innovative and evidence-based SBCC strategies to address barriers, transform attitudes, and promote family planning in West Africa. Our objectives are to increase demand for family planning, to enhance active support among key secondary audiences, and to address social norms, creating a favorable environment for family planning. We work in 4 areas, one of them being today's topic, provider behavior change. The other areas or themes are audience segmentation, male engagement, and cross-sectoral SBC. We use as a framework the socio-economical model, but we focus mainly on the community, organizational, and interpersonal aspects of it. So let's get to our analysis, and first a brief overview on Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire shows an elevated fertility rate. The fertility rate is 5.0 on average. It is much higher in some areas of the country. Around 15% of the births happen within short intervals. And contraceptive prevalence is 21%, with low use among women of reproductive age. However, 21% of the women want to limit their birth, and 41% want to space the next birth by at least 2 years. So there is hope. Why did we conduct this analysis? There are many factors that have been widely documented linked to underuse of contraception in West Africa and other parts of the world. Among these factors, we can cite lack of insufficient knowledge, either of the target audience or of modern methods. We can cite personal, cultural, or religious biases associated both to the target audience and to specific methods. We can also cite insufficient training on service delivery skills and frequent stockouts in the facilities, the service provision facilities. So, could we get a better understanding of these factors or other factors that maybe gain some insight into improving the quality of family planning services? And could we gain any insight from the ways that health provider positive deviants overcome such factors and excel at service provision no matter what? The objectives of the analysis were to identify current and most important health provider barriers to deliver quality family planning services, and to identify strategies used by health provider positive deviants to overcome the barriers. Next slide, please. We have 2 phases in our analysis. The first phase is the barrier analysis itself. We first conducted a literature review. We conducted individual interviews and also did focus group discussions, both with healthcare providers and with clients. And then out of these interviews, we got plausible positive deviants, and to ensure that these providers were actually excelling at their work, we assigned some mystery clients to visit them and evaluate by themselves. So we selected a group of positive deviants, and then with the selected positive deviants and the mystery clients, we conducted a validation workshop. So we finally conducted interviews with these group of individuals and analyzed the ways of coping with the barriers that they use to excel at their work. Next slide, please. The barriers identified were categorized in 3 major groups: personal opinions and biases, capacity and skills, attitudes and behaviors. Next slide, please. Among the personal opinions and biases, we found cultural or traditional biases associated mostly to the target audience, sometimes with methods, also the age or quality of the client, and negative perceptions of contraception. I will not read this slide in detail, but I will ask you to pay attention to the citation in the middle. I have a 16-year-old daughter. I imagine a 16-year-old girl coming to ask me for a method. It just breaks my heart, even if this is my job. Next slide, please. Capacity and skills. We found lack of training updates and also lack of knowledge of specific methods. Mostly knowledge of IUDs. Next slide, please. Attitudes and behaviors. We found practices associated to IUDs that were not appreciated, and we found sometimes a lack of communication about non-reversible methods. And I also want to call your attention to this quote. No need to discuss vasectomy or tubal ligation. Even if you've had all the children you want, if you must go through life with your ligated tubes, what have you become? Next slide, please. In the analysis of positive deviance, we found two major areas: motivation of model providers and communication strategies. Next slide, please. The motivation of providers. Most importantly, we found that they had in common what we call the love for the trade. Considering family planning provision important, enjoying what they do, being proud about what they do. We also found that training might increase the motivation and love for family planning, and when peers have the opportunity to share experiences, that might also have a positive influence on your motivation to do a good job. Next slide, please. Finally, as I said, we identified communication strategies. Most importantly, the approach with the client, being empathic, warm approach, or what is called in French l'accueil, which can be more translated like making you feel welcome. And then we found out that these positive deviants also usually help their explanation, help the communication with the client with the aid of images. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, there are people that we can consider positive deviants. They offer the full range of family planning services no matter what. They demonstrate empathy and good listening skills, and this enhances the client's livelihood or either adopting or continuing to use modern contraception. Now, it is not possible to teach the love for the trade, obviously, but what we found likely to happen is that if you allow training opportunities where there is sharing of experiences, when you have role models to share their experiences, and when you provide opportunities between peers to share their experiences, this might help increase the motivation for the job. Next slide. Thank you very much for your time. This will be all from me, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Luis. Our next presenter will be Jessica Vandermark. Jessica is the Senior Marketing Advisor for Breakthrough Action and Director at Canberra Collective. Her work sits at the intersection of customer insights, social and behavior change, communications, and strategy. She has extensive experience working on family planning, segmentation, social and behavior change, and innovative projects across Africa, Europe, and North America. Jessica has over 10 years' experience conducting global qualitative and quantitative market research. Jessica holds an MBA from Thunderbird School of Global Management and graduated with honors from the University of Maryland with a BS in International Management. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Luis, for your presentation as well. And please let me know if you have any difficulties with my sound during this presentation. So today I'll be sharing some of the results of the Beyond Bias project. This is a 3-year project funded by the Gates Foundation, led by Pathfinder International, and Camber Collective is a part of this consortium, as well as Berry and YLAB. The objective of the project is to address provider bias towards young and or unmarried women seeking family planning services. So we'll take a look at the overview of the project phases. We started in January of 2017, and the project is currently ongoing. So far, we have conducted a literature review and expert interviews, which allowed us to draft what we're calling a provider bias driver tree, which provides a framework for categorizing potential forms of provider bias. We then conducted a survey across Tanzania, Burkina Faso, and Pakistan among family planning providers, including midwives, nurses, and doctors. Out of the survey data, we developed a segmentation, and the project is currently in a phase where the segmentation results and HCP research are being used to develop and iterate on prototypes for intervention solutions. So let's look first at the bias driver tree and some of the insights we learned in the quantitative testing. We identified 3 main categories of bias, which you'll see on the left: the biographic, situational, and societal, which has some links and relevance to the insights in Luis's presentation that we just saw. And of course, across these, we found opportunities and challenges for addressing provider bias. For example, we heard from providers that they counsel youth frequently and enjoy working with youth, and the vast majority feel supported by their supervisors for providing methods to youth. However, most of those providers lack training, and most of them don't feel well paid for the work that they do. In terms of provider beliefs, it was encouraging to see that providers agree that sex is part of a healthy life for young people. However, most providers feel that young people lack modesty, and a significant proportion think that providing methods to unmarried youth makes them more promiscuous. It was also encouraging to see that 2/3 of providers do not believe that they know what their young clients need as soon as they come in. But we also saw that half of providers don't believe young people are capable of choosing the method that is best for them. There were also quite a number of beliefs around specific methods. For example, IUDs are not appropriate for women without children, hormonal methods are not safe for young growing bodies, or that certain methods should simply be avoided if the woman has not yet had a child. So we started to see some variation across provider responses, and also how bias could manifest at different points in the counseling experience, depending on different client characteristics. We then conducted a latent class segmentation analysis, which you'll see on the slide. We took the survey data from 811 respondents across 3 countries and ran the segmentation analysis using variables related to attitudes, beliefs, and provider behaviors, as well as provider attributes, which came from our provider bias tree analysis. So let's take a look at the segmentation. There were in total 6 segments that we uncovered. The first and the largest segment is the detached professionals, which is made up mostly of Burkinabe midwives who frequently engage youth clients and have used family planning themselves. The majority of detached professionals are trained on youth family planning, but they aren't particularly comfortable with youth and they don't particularly enjoy serving them. Detached professionals are less strained at work relative to other segments, though they're somewhat disgruntled regarding their compensation. This group is also acutely concerned about their clinic's reputation and are afraid that providing family planning to youth may be a reputational risk. Next, we have the average passives, which are mostly nurses and midwives who tend to hold less strong religious beliefs and exhibit more neutral behaviors when it comes to family planning counseling. They're neutral about whether they think sex is healthy and whether they enjoy working with youth. Overall, they do not seem interested in becoming invested in youth, and in contrast to some other segments, they do not appear to be overly concerned with their client's reputational risk of using family planning. The next group is nearly entirely Pakistani. This content conservatives. They tend to be younger, less religious, and professionally content. They do enjoy working with youth and generally trust youth to make their own decisions, but they demonstrate a strong distrust of hormonal methods and conservative perspectives on sex before marriage. They hold conservative beliefs on youth autonomy and social roles, and nearly half of them support the need for spousal or parental consent, which is more than any other segment. These providers believe that they're responsible for teaching youth how to behave, and are generally misinformed regarding the safety of hormonal methods for youth. Next, we have the impromptu sister, and this group skews younger, is less educated, and appears to strongly identify and connect with youth clients. This can mean that she might judge them for making mistakes or boss them around like younger siblings. Nearly all impromptu sisters feel they have a responsibility to teach youth and have an acute concern for fertility delays. Impromptu sisters are professionally strained, with nearly all feeling overbooked and underpaid. However, nearly all enjoy working with youth and are very comfortable counseling on family planning. Next, we have the sympathetic guardians, and they tend to be...
I'm sorry, if you could just slow down just a bit.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
The sympathetic guardians are relatively young, tend to find youth easy and enjoyable to work with, and they respect their decision-making. They recognize the importance in delaying early pregnancy and are not concerned about clinic or client reputations. Although sympathetic guardians are open to serving all clients, they can also be misinformed, and they would deny a modern method to about a third of millipar's clients and a quarter of unmarried clients. So the last segment, this is the smallest one, is the paternalistic clinicians. They're predominantly older doctors who frequently counsel youth and are generally comfortable doing so despite considerable generational gaps. Some progressive attitudes around youth decision-making and timing of pregnancy are offset by strong marital and nulliparous biases, as well as a fear of competing SRH risks. This segment is likely more set in their ways of thinking and style of counseling. So just to take a big picture look at this again, I think some of the trends that we see significant variance on across these 6 segments were themes like how close or distant providers felt to their clients, how conservative they felt with regards to social norms, and how well they were informed or trained. And what's interesting is when we examine the composition of the segments by region, we see that each country has a strong concentration of a single segment. Over half of all Tanzanian providers fall into the average passive segment, while a similar proportion of Pakistani providers are conservatives. In Burkina Faso, the detached professionals account for nearly 4 out of 5 providers. We do, however, find some segments across all of the geographies, such as the average passives and the impromptu sisters. So where are we now? In parallel to the research that I just described to you, YLabs has been leading qualitative design research to gain insights from providers, young people, and other health system stakeholders to develop a series of concept solutions that could help minimize provider bias. YLabs has been conducting rough prototyping sessions with 97 healthcare providers and 22 youth in Tanzania, Pakistan, and Burkina Faso to assess the potential impact, desirability, and feasibility of prototype concepts. And the current stage of the project has involved selecting a subset of the rough prototype concepts for each country to further test in live prototyping. And the goals of live prototyping are to develop and test high-fidelity prototypes where users have as close to a real experience as possible and offer feedback for refinement. Following the live prototyping and the implementation and evaluation phases of the project, Pathfinder will implement final solutions in all 3 countries with evaluation conducted by Barry. So the prototypes build upon insights from the drivers of bias with content tailored by segment. YLabs has focused on specific drivers from the bias driver tree and has defined a number of behavior change mechanisms that they can address through their solutions, such as improving emotional connectivity to youth or creating greater accountability for service quality. Across the proposed solutions, we're working together to tailor content to be adapted for segments in each of the geographies. So this is a little bit different, but the last thing I wanted to share with you was one of the other interesting analyses that we conducted during this project. What we realized at the outset of the project is that it's understandably difficult to measure bias, and approaches such as mystery clients can only go so far in a context such as family planning. So what we did in our survey was present providers with hypothetical client scenarios, which asked them to consider clients with different profiles. We varied the scenarios by client age, marital status, and number of children, and asked providers how they would treat those clients. For example, what they might do or ask a client before counseling them, or which methods they think would be appropriate. We then analyzed the responses and found some interesting results. If you look at the data on the left, you'll see the results for 2 of the questions we asked. Would you provide or decline counseling? And would you provide or decline modern methods? So the red line is the average of the decline, the rate of decline, which we've set at 0 as the baseline. And you can see how the results then varied by the client profile that was presented. So the further the blue dots are to the right, the more likely the providers were, on average, to decline counseling or modern methods. So what this allows us to do is disaggregate the bias by age, marital status, and parity. And it turns out that the providers in our sample were significantly more likely to decline counseling or methods based on marital status or parity as opposed to age, which has 2 important implications. One is how we should think about designing research in the future to consistently tease out these nuances. And 2, how designing solutions for youth bias alone may be the wrong target. So we're considering and have considered these results in our segmentation analysis and are thinking through ways to incorporate these findings into the solution development process. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'll now turn the presentation back to Giovanni or Heather
Thank you so much, Jessica. Our next presenter will be Kanyansola Ibana. Kanyansola is a senior associate at Ideas 42. She currently supports Breakthrough Action Malawi, working to improve family planning outcomes by using insights from behavioral economics to change provider behavior. She holds an AB in psychology from Harvard College. Kanyansola, welcome.
Thank you, Heather. So today I'll be talking about an ongoing activity in which the Breakthrough Action Malawi team is examining the role of provider behavior in helping clients reach successful family planning outcomes by using a behavioral economics approach. For this activity, we specifically chose to focus on provider behavior because provider behavior is often cited as a barrier to reducing a met need and improving method mix. And while there are many supply-side interventions that target provider behavior, not many focus on the nuances of provider behavior or have examined the complex drivers of provider behavior and how it affects the health outcomes of clients in the provision of family planning services. Now, as we see in the image, boxes clearly labeled to indicate they should not be stacked or still stacked on top of each other. And this illustrates the inconsistencies that we often see in human behavior and something that behavioral economics tries to understand. Behavioral economics uses insights from psychology, economics, and other social sciences to unpack drivers of human behavior. It recognizes that context heavily affects the way we make decisions and actions. So in the case of providers, they can sometimes behave like the individuals who stack these boxes. They know what they're supposed to do, but the context they are operating under may prevent them from actually doing it. So behavioral economics helps us understand these contextual features or nuances in family planning provision and uptake to drive provider behavior change. There have already been successful applications of behavioral economics, such as in reducing surgical errors and boosting adherence to childbirth clinical guidelines through the use of checklists, shifting prescription habits towards more generic low-cost options, facilitating referrals for antenatal and facility-based delivery, and lastly, the integration of family planning services and HIV treatment through the use of reminders embedded in electronic medical records. So for this activity, there are three main objectives. One is to continue fresh thinking to the definition of relevant provider behaviors as tied to health outcomes in family planning. Establish where behavioral economics may be a powerful tool to drive provider behavior change. And lastly, ensure that activity enhances the existing programming and supports the strategic objectives of Ministry of Health in Malawi and also our implementing partner. This activity follows a three-stage methodology. First is the problem definition stage, which we completed, and we identify key provider behaviors to change or mitigate. We also identify subpopulations of interest. The behavioral diagnosis stage, which we are currently in, we've generated hypotheses about drivers of behavior related to family planning and reproductive health provision and uptake, and conducted a behavioral mapping exercise that charted the various decision and action steps that providers need to take to counsel women on appropriate contraceptive methods. We then refine these hypotheses and use them to develop our qualitative instruments. And next, as part of the behavioral diagnosis stage, we'll use the qualitative instruments that we developed to conduct field research and collect data. And lastly, in the design and user testing, once we've collected the data from our field research to confirm or disprove our hypotheses, we'll then translate the data we collect into insights to generate design ideas and interventions based on feedback from our implementing partner, user testing, and also known behavioral economic designs in the field. So as part of the problem definition stage, we conducted a situational analysis that included an in-depth literature review and a scope and visit where we talked to local stakeholders and made facility visits. And what we found is that while Malawi is just shy of the Family Planning 2020 commitment with a modern contraceptive prevalence rate of 58% and an unmet need for family planning of 19% among married women, highly effective methods such as long-acting reversible contraceptives are underrepresented in Malawi's method mix. We also see that clients are only hearing about certain methods and not hearing about other methods, which could indicate that using a modern method does not exactly mean a woman is doing so based on the methods counseled on, suggesting a need for improved quality of counseling. And lastly, methods that are in use don't seem to fully satisfy women's reproductive health needs. So 60% of women use modern contraception rely on injectables, male condoms, or pills, but more than 40% have a 12-month discontinuation rate. And so due to these factors and other insights we generated from the situational analysis, for this activity, we decided to focus on the following problem statement. Providers do not counsel clients on appropriate contraceptive options. While there are many provider behaviors we could work on, we chose this problem because effective counseling on a broad range of appropriate family planning options to meet a woman's reproductive needs is a prerequisite for her to make an informed decision to take up a contraceptive method. And evidence shows that effective counseling on methods is a reliable way to promote uptake, particularly for long-acting and permanent methods. So before I wrap up the presentation, I wanted to quickly take you through part of our behavioral diagnosis in which we generated our hypotheses. So as I mentioned before, as part of the behavioral diagnosis stage, we conducted a behavioral mapping exercise, and we generated nearly 100 hypotheses that we refined to a final set of 25, in which we used to develop our qualitative instruments. One of the hypotheses we generated is that providers rationalize incomplete counseling. And there are a number of psychological principles that might underlie the decision for providers to rationalize incomplete or abridged counseling in a way that can prevent a woman from taking up an appropriate method. And based on our scoping visit, it seems likely that outcome bias may be affecting provider decisions about what methods to counsel women. This bias results from our tendency to make decisions on the basis of observable outcomes of past events, without considering the processes that brought about those outcomes. For example, while only a tiny minority of CEOs of leading U.S. companies are women, it is far more likely that this is explained by the process of choosing CEOs instead of the underlying preferences of women. Similarly, among women using modern contraceptive methods, nearly half use injectables, and providers that we spoke to during our scoping visit all indicated that the clients most commonly use depot. And if providers interpret this outcome as representative of an underlying preference of women and not a result of the process by which they acquire the methods, this could lead them to believe or conclude that women are not interested in other methods, and especially if those other methods are seen as more difficult or time-consuming to provide. So as I mentioned, we're up to the behavioral diagnosis stage, and we're getting ready to conduct field research. So we'll be conducting field work in early August, and then based on the data we collect, we'll do a code design workshop with partners. And once we do that, we will iterate on those designs and hope to create our initial prototypes and user test them in September. And by October, we hope to finalize our prototypes and produce a final report of the activity. So thank you for your time. I'll now hand it back to Giovanni.
Thank you, Kanyansola. And now I will hand things over to Breakthrough Action Program Officer Giovanni Cabaness to introduce 2 new Breakthrough Action resources and to moderate the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Heather. So we'd like to take a quick opportunity to introduce everyone to a few new Breakthrough Action resources that have been developed to support both provider behavior change and provider behavior assessments, as well as some existing resources that have been developed to, again, support implementation and design of provider behavior change SBC interventions. So the first new resource is the Provider Behavior Assessment How-To Guide. The How-To Guide provides a general overview of how you might conduct a provider behavior assessment. So the provider behavior assessment is intended to identify barriers, facilitators, and best practices from providers that may inhibit or facilitate service quality. or service quality improvement. That how-to guide is available on the Health Compass and is available both online and as a PDF. This document is a work in progress. As you've seen from our other presentations, we have interventions currently in progress like the Malawi behavior change intervention that will offer new insights into how to conduct a provider behavior assessment. So as those insights emerge, we'll continue to update that document. Next, we have the providers as an audience trending topic. This trending topic is also available on the Health Compass. The trending topic brings together a number of program tools and resources, peer-reviewed literature, and again, how-to guidance and implementation kits that will support provider behavior change interventions. We've tried to capture the majority of known resources, but if there are other resources that you feel should be captured on the trending topic, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and supply us with those resources. Additionally, in this trending topic, you can find a provider behavior change mini toolkit that was developed under Transform FAR. So this mini toolkit has videos, exercises, and facilitation tips to conduct a provider behavior change mini training. Those resources are available in French and again are hosted through the trending topic. Finally, we have the providers as an audience springboard discussion. The springboard discussion will be initiated immediately following this webinar, and our moderators, who are the presenters on this webinar, will be available for an additional hour after the webinar to engage with you on the topic. If in the Q&A we don't have time to answer questions, those questions will be responded to on the Springboard discussion page. This discussion thread will remain live, and so at any point you can return to it, share additional resources, ask additional questions, just provide additional insights from your own work so that we can keep the discussion alive. Also, I wanted to mention we have the Provider Behavior Change Implementation Toolkit, as well as the Service Implementation or Service Communication Toolkit that also support provider behavior change. So again, you can find all of those resources on the Health Compass. And now we'd like to open up the floor to any questions you might have. So feel free to add your questions in the chat box below. You can see as you're adding your questions, Marcella will help to moderate and make sure that we're capturing your questions. So the first question that I'd like to share, I think is for both Jessica and Kenyon Sola. And Jessica, if you can respond first. We had a question about the advantage of using prototyping in your interventions. So the idea that rather than just designing and implementing an intervention, that prototyping that intervention, which means some type of iteration over time and audience feedback. What is the advantage of using that above what are considered more traditional development approaches?
Sure, thank you for that. And I would just like to say that YLabs on the Beyond Bias project, they are the experts on this prototyping piece for the human-centered design component, but I will do my best to give my perspective from what I've learned in collaboration with them, is that I think the prototyping allows one to help understand what solution concepts are desirable, identify what changes are needed, but it also helps generate new ideas. And one of the things I particularly appreciated was this idea that you move from a very rough prototype to something that is more refined, and something that is more rough allows someone who's interacting with it to really feel free to share their opinion, but give their stated perspective or reaction to a concept. And then over time, you refine and move to something where it's actually a concept that they're interacting with. And so the process itself, I don't think it's meant to have the correct idea or concept right from the beginning, but the process of evolution and the small things that you learn along the way are what helps to make the end solution that much more interesting and meaningful.
Thank you, Jessica.
Oh, and I mentioned that. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say Theo from YLabs will be on the Springboard chat discussion thread, so she can answer more questions as well on the Springboard thread after this webinar.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. And Kenyon Sola, if you wanted to respond to that as well.
Yes. So from the Ideas 42 perspective and also through Breakthrough Action Malawi, we, instead of just when we design our interventions or our design ideas, before we actually implement them in the field, we want to prototype, because what we design might not be relevant to the people who we are intending to use it. So we want to make sure that people are able to respond to it, whether it's a checklist or a poster that we create, because we design these interventions outside, not together with the populations of interest. So we want to make sure that it is contextually relevant to the people that we will initially implement the intervention with.
Thank you very much, Kenyon Sola. And the next question returns back to Jessica's presentation, where she was discussing sort of the rigorous audience segmentation process they undertook. And so the question is, once you've identified the various segments, how do you quantify how many providers fall into each segment? Are these estimates, or is there some additional survey that needs to be conducted to classify the various types of providers? So could you talk a little bit more about that methodology for identifying the size of the segments in each context?
Sure. So the segmentation is based on a quantitative survey, about 300 or so, give or take, providers in each country, and the sampling was done on as randomized as possible of a sampling methodology, so that the proportions that we find in the sample are as relatively representative as possible to the population of providers. So within the sample, we can say this percent are detached professionals, for example. I think the other piece of the question is then how do we know or confirm who, once we go out to do implementation, who the rest of these providers are. And for that, we have a profiling tool, which has been developed, which basically takes the entire survey and distills it down to really the 5 or 6 most important questions to distinguish the segments. And so now the question is, in implementation, how could this tool be used? How do we want to use it? Do we need to segment all providers to actually get the population level, so the percentage of all providers that belong to different segments? But because of the sampling methodology and the way that the segmentation was done, we can feel relatively confident that the proportions that we found in our sample should be similar to what we will find in the population.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. The next question is for Kenyon Sola, and this is a question that I have as well. Given that you have so many hypotheses that emerge from your initial phase, how do you decide which hypothesis to test? Kenyon Sola, we're having trouble hearing you right now. Kenyon Sola, can you check that your audio is not on mute? Okay, while we're working on Kenyon Sola's audio, let's move back to another question for Jessica. The question is about...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry. We'll go back to the question. Thank you, Kenyon.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't know what was going on. Yeah, so back to the question you asked. We decided to narrow down on the hypotheses, first based on the feasibility of us to collect evidence in the field. And also we looked at the strength of the evidence we had thus far from our problem definition stage, where we conducted literature review and also did an initial site visit to support the hypotheses that we had already. And that's how we narrowed down. And also, lastly, we looked at what are behavioral economic interventions that have been done in the past to address some of the hypotheses that we had. Because again, we want to make sure at the end of the activity, we design an intervention that our implementing partner can take and implement in the field.
Great, which I think leads us into the next question, which is about when you're applying behavioral economics principles, is there any value to selecting sort of smaller sub-behaviors rather than looking at these larger overall behavioral outcomes? So the example that was given is if you're talking about interpersonal communication for service providers, breaking it down into smaller bits, so how they welcome the clients, how much time is provided with each client, and whether the provider follows a checklist. And then in that way, if you're looking at more sub-behaviors, does it help with narrowing down a better hypothesis for the behavior change?
Yes, and maybe I elaborate more on the hypotheses. So we generate hypotheses, but then we also had different psychological principles that we think are driving the hypotheses. And so we want to explore each of those. So there might be one hypothesis, but maybe 5 psychological principles that we think are driving it. So when we develop our qualitative instruments, we're not just asking with just one broad question of the barrier hypotheses that we think are coming into play, where we're asking multiple sub-questions that get into more, as you said, sub-behaviors, or maybe smaller behaviors that we can understand better exactly. So like, what exactly is the provider doing when they're interacting with clients that might be preventing them from counseling on a suite of the family option methods. So yes, it's hard to kind of target one big behavior because there's so many decisions and actions that go into play with a provider providing counseling appropriately on contraceptive options. So we do break it down in our qualitative method. So when we do collect the data, we're able to say, okay, it's, as the example suggested, okay, maybe the way they're welcoming clients or the way they're framing the family planning options to clients that we need to address.
Canonzola. And this next question is both for Louise and Jessica. So in both of your interventions, you identified different types of providers or different types of provider segments. So when you're developing an intervention to respond to what you found in terms of the different characteristics of those segments, how do you develop, or do you need to develop different interventions to respond to specific segments? So maybe if Louise can take this question first.
Sure. Sorry. I think one advantage of knowing the characteristics of a specific segment is that you get to personalize your approach. So in terms of training of the health provider, for example, you might choose what type of communication, which way of offering counseling or suggesting counseling techniques might be more appropriate for the segment. So in the analysis we did not really deal with this, but something that we learned looking at the different preferences of the healthcare providers is that it's like any other job. In order to do well your job, you have to be comfortable with what you are doing. So it's great to offer flexibility to the way that the provider is going to offer the services and to the way that the provider is going to offer the counseling. I'm sure Jessica has more to add to this.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
Jessica, please.
Yeah, I can pick up with some thoughts. Yeah, so the question is, you have this segmentation, it's statistically robust, it's intuitive, but what do you do with it? And I think there's a couple things. You have to balance practicality with impact that you're trying to have. And so one of the things that you could do, for example, is to prioritize, to say, okay, across the 6, we think that we really have a better chance in the lifetime of this project to see some changes in behavior with 3 out of the 6 segments, for example. There's also an element of, when we think about the interventions, adapting the concept of the intervention and adapting the content. And I've had some conversations with YLab, a lot of food references. So this concept of every pizza crust is the same, but the toppings might be different. So what you might have is concepts that are roughly similar across all segments, but content, which will be modified and adapted by segment. So we're incorporating that in the Beyond Bias project. And also the element of prioritization is a little bit different from our normal approach, just because we see such differences in proportions of segments by country. There really is one predominant segment per country, which is dictating a bit of the prioritization process as well. So it's really, there's a couple of different ways that you can achieve, basically make the use of the segmentation, but not have to do full developed strategies for each of the 6 segments.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think we can direct this next question to Louise. The comment is that we seem to be making an assumption that counseling on more contraceptive methods is better than counseling appropriately based on an understanding of the woman's situation and her preferences. So is there some evidence that counseling on more methods equals better counseling? Or if you can just comment on sort of the approach that Transform FAR has taken to training providers in family planning counseling.
I doubt there would be any evidence that more methods equals better counseling, and I would think that if we're making that assumption, we're making the wrong assumption. I think counseling has to be completely centered on the client. Now, me as a healthcare provider, I should have a good understanding of all the methods, the variety of methods, to be able to accommodate to the client's needs, but not necessarily sit down with the client and explain everything from pills to permanent methods, because that's not better counseling. The method selection should be definitely based on the situation, the preferences of the client, and not necessarily showing all the methods in every conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Louise. And this next question is for Kenyon Sola. Given and I know we're still in early stages of the project, but given the limited sampling that was done in Malawi, how can we sort of extrapolate more broadly from those results? And how could we potentially adapt what we've learned to other contexts, such as the example given was to a country in a largely diverse country such as Nigeria?
I wonder if you can clarify on the limited sampling done in Malawi. What is that referring to?
I think that they're currently referring to the number of providers you've spoken to or interacted with so far.
Oh, I see. Well, I would just say that so that was just part of to get to our problem definition. Our field research will have a greater number of providers in both. We've chosen Lilongwe and Machinga to do the field work. So I wouldn't quite conclude that we have a limited sampling as of yet, as we haven't conducted the field research. But with this activity, what we're doing is that we're working with breakthrough. There's 2 activities, breakthrough action and breakthrough research. And breakthrough research has actually done a comprehensive literature review to look at provider behavior change in 5 health areas, and one of them is family planning. So what we're doing is, looking at the applications of behavioral economics in family planning, not only in Malawi, but in other countries such as Nigeria, Zambia, and I think can't remember the other countries, but they've done a comprehensive literature review to see what are the areas that behavioral economics has promised and what has already been done in behavioral economic interventions. And we're going to, part of our work for Breakthrough Action Malawi is taking those past successful interventions and understanding the context of Malawi and seeing if we can apply the past interventions to what we found in Malawi. So we would be actually using, we would not just only be, the interventions that we design won't just be something, will be based on prior successful research. So I think that given the research from Breakthrough Research, that can be applied to other countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Kanyensola. And we have about 3 minutes left. So in this time, I would just ask each presenter to just give about 30 seconds on what are the next steps for their work in provider behavior change. So Luis, if you can just give us what are the next steps for Transform FAR?
Shared about the mini toolkit that we have available based on this analysis. So we have 3 videos and a set of 6 icebreakers that we're starting to use with healthcare providers, with actually trainers of healthcare providers, so that they can do role models, role playing, and they can look at videos of situations of what is appropriate counseling, what is not appropriate counseling. This was learned from the warm or the welcoming approach that we saw in positive deviants. So that's where we are at now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Luis. And thank you for speaking today. And Jessica, for the next steps for the Beyond Bias project.
Sure. Yeah, the Beyond Bias project is ongoing, so Camper will continue to be involved on that. We're starting to draft some peer-reviewed journals on the research, some of the pieces I presented today. And also part of the Project Breakthrough Action, which is doing some work, Camper's involved in some of the work in West Africa that will be looking at provider behavior change in collaboration with other USAID projects such as Amplify and others.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica. And then just really briefly, I know you recapped, but Kanyensola, what are in the next few months, the next steps for the Malawi project? Okay, I think we're having trouble with audio again, but I would like to thank our presenters again for speaking. Again, thank you for everyone who participated, who sent in their questions, who will be joining us on Springboard after this. And if you could take just a minute, we have 6 poll questions that will help to inform both our future webinars and let us know whether and what you've gained from this webinar. So on behalf of Breakthrough Action, thank you again for listening in today, and we will make the recording and the presentations available after the webinar. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you on Springboard.